Well, what's up? My name is Adam. I used to work here at CCV for like 10 years, so I guess that makes me technically like CCV alumni or something like that. I worked here for like 10 years. My wife is here on staff. She is actually the one responsible for the reason that you're not going to be able to take me seriously today, so I appreciate that. The nice thing about not being on staff anymore is I don't have to follow all the rules that I had to follow before. So instead of just asking you to volunteer for Kids Camp, I can threaten you to volunteer for Kids Camp. So if you don't sign up, I'm going to turn that AC down lower than it already is. Okay, people? So help my wife out. Get on Kids Camp. It's time. I also have two very young daughters, 1 and 3. Thank you for your prayers. I appreciate that. Yesterday I had someone come up to me and they're like, "Man, you really look tired." I was like, "No, this is how I look now. This is just me." So that's why this is, kind of creeping back, and then this is that's just who I am. So that's a basic introduction of me. So I'm totally stoked to be back here today. We're gonna have some fun, hopefully learn some stuff. So let's dive into it. Brian, when he preached, he told a story, a bedtime story. If you were here this week, it was Horton hatches an egg, and I texted him I was mad because he never actually finished the book. So today, I am going to start with another story, and I think this one will be good for bedtime if those of you have kids, so feel free to throw this one out there. This one's called The Frog and the Scorpion. Let's go. Once upon a time, there was a frog. One day, Frog was sitting by a riverbank when along came a scorpion. "Hello, Brother Frog," said Scorpion. "I wonder if you might be so kind as to give me a ride across the river on your back." Frog knew that Scorpion could not swim. "I don't think that's a good idea," said Frog. "You have a deadly sting. You might kill me." "But why would I do that?" replied Scorpion. "If I stung you, we would both die." Thought Frog. "That makes sense. All right, Scorpion, jump on my back, and I will give you a ride across the river," he said. So Scorpion jumped on Frog's back, and Frog began to swim across the river. But halfway across, Scorpion took his deadly sting and stuck it into Frog's back. And as the poison filled Frog's body, his arms began to stiffen, and they both began to sink. "Why?" gasped Frog in despair. "Sorry, Frog," said Scorpion. "It's my nature." And Frog and Scorpion died. The end. Right? That's a great kid's book. Kid goes to bed crying. You're like, "You're a dad?" All right, so this story actually is an ancient folklore. It goes back way, way, way back. And it's essentially a metaphor for people being who people are and not changing, which leads me to the question that I want to talk about today. Do you think that most people are capable of real change? All right, so this is what I want to do. I want everyone, even you introverts, to give me a thumbs up, a thumb somewhere in the middle if you're unsure, or a thumbs down. Do you think most people will and can inherently change? Go ahead and give me a side of what you see. I am seeing a boatload of thumbs down, a lot of in between. I'm seeing some wiggling, for those of you indecisive people. All right, so that is what we are going to conquer today. We're in the middle of this series. We're actually at the end of the series called Asking for a Friend. And Frank kicked us off. He asked, "What do I do when I thought I believed, but now I have doubts?" Brian asked, "What do I do when I'm not good at relationships?" And last week, Frank hit us with, "Can Jesus really impact my life?" So today, I'm going to kind of wrap everything up, and we're going to be asking this question, if we think most people are capable of real change. The problem when we talk about change is that for a lot of people, immediately, it kind of gives some kind of baggage. You know what I mean? There's like usually someone or something that comes to mind when I'm talking about not only change, but people's inability to change at times. Maybe the first thing that comes to mind is a relationship gone sour. Maybe it's a divorce. Someone you were hoping would change, they never did. You didn't know this trait when you got married, and there it is. Maybe the first thing to come to mind is you or someone that you know who's struggling with addiction, right? And you wonder if they'll ever get out of that because you've been burned a million times. Maybe you're thinking about someone who's just not good at relationships and you were hoping they would change. There's just so many different things. Anger. Someone who has an anger problem, you've had it since as long as you can remember when you were a little kid, and you're just kind of wondering, is this thing possible? Or maybe it's not you, maybe it's the person you're married to, right? You kind of had this version of them that you hoped they would turn into when you got married, and they never came into that, and they kind of kept these habits that they've always had that you hoped would get kicked at one point. Maybe you're like me, and you're wondering if, like, I wonder if I am personally capable of the changes that I wish that I had in my life. Or maybe you've experienced more of life. Maybe you're a little bit older, and you feel like you're not sure if an old dog can be, taught new tricks. But that is basically what we want to come to terms with today. I've been talking a lot about human nature recently with my wife, Melissa, and that is because she will not stop talking about this personality type test that has swept the nation and swept my home more than I could ever explain to you. It is called, and you might have heard this word before, it is called the Enneagram test. The Enneagram test. Now, for some of you, this is new, but essentially it's this test, and it's incredibly old. It was made popular again recently by a book that came out, and it's essentially these 9, I think there's 9 of them, 9 personalities, and each of them have kind of a main characteristic. And this was brought back to light by this guy who basically said, hey, when people are healthy, they serve God's kingdom in incredible ways. So these are 9 different normals. And when they're unhealthy, it reveals like kind of what sins tend to take them down. So anyway, can you throw that image back up again? So these are the 9 types. Did any of you, when you read those, you know exactly right off the bat what one you are, like right after reading that? So these are all the different ones. My wife's a 3, so that's fun to keep up with. And then the reason why we've been having this conversation recently is because I am an 8. I am an 8. I am the challenger, hence why I already threatened you one time while we started the service. And the problem that we had and the conversation that we had is that I told Melissa, I don't want to be an 8. I know that's not how it works, but I was like, I don't want to be an 8. As you can see, 8s are known as the challengers. Their basic fear is being controlled by others or micromanaged, right? They like being in control of their own life. Some traits that can be described are dominant, protective, excessive, which most people around me would probably use, energetic, forceful at times, and they like things to be direct. Some strengths they have is a good sense of right and wrong, action-oriented. They can be intense, responsible, take charge, decisive, and fair, not fear, maybe. And the challenge is they can be intimidating, they can be controlling, confrontational, aggressive, and my wife made me say blunt and impulsive. Now, when they explain these things, they're like, these are 9 normals. So when they are working well, the gifts can be used well, right? So I might have the ability to lead groups of people in a way that other personality types might not. But I still didn't want to be an 8. See, I wanted to be a 7. A 7 is basically known as the enthusiast, right? And the reason why I want to be a 7 is because my boy Bob Goff is a 7. Now, some of you may not know Bob Goff. Bob Goff spoke at CCV, I think like a year ago, and Bob Goff wrote 2 books that I love. Love Does and Everybody Always. And this dude just loves people abundantly. I mean, he is just like, you get some love, you get some love. Like, they walk into a room and they are the life of the party. They are just fun to be around. They have curiosity and optimism and basically all these things that if I was like, yeah, that's me, but it kind of isn't, but it's me, that's me, right? Pull that image back up. When I see that image of him riding that Vespa with the balloons, the problem is with my personality, I don't look at that and go, wow, what whimsy and adventure in his face. I think, what are you hiding, balloon boy? You know? What are the skeletons in your closet? If you're doing this, there's something else going on that we don't know about. And I can't stand that that's like my go-to of my personality, this like cynicism and this questioning of intentions and all these things. But we're just talking about personality. What about when we start talking about habits, right? What about when we start talking about habits? Everyone who applies to work at CCV has to take this test. It's called the Myers-Briggs test. And there's a couple letters at the end. You're either a P or a J, and I'm a P. And this is the part of my life that I'm not very good at small details. That's the part of my life that kind of drives. The P part of me is the reason why I don't forget I forget lots of little details. But I do know my anniversary, though. That's important. It's, I'm just kidding. It's June 18th. I expect a thank you message on Facebook on that day. All right? I expect to remember these things, these little details, but I'm thinking about other thoughts and different things, and I miss that, and I hate this quality of myself. But what about when we're not just talking about, like, little personality quirks like that, right? What about we're talking about things that distance us from others and things that destroy our ability to get close to God? What about the things in my life that I wish I could change that I'm not willing to admit to this large group of people from a stage because I don't like them genuinely, or I'm embarrassed by them, or I know they are not good for me? You know, what about, not necessarily for me, but what about when the thing in yourself that's been a part of you that you've never been able to change is like an explosive anger? Like when you get mad, you have the ability to really, like, you throw stuff, you break things, you put holes in walls, and that's a thing that you've wanted to change about your life for a long time, but you can't. Or what about like a hereditarily fueled inclination towards addiction, right? You've had it handed down to you, and whether it's gambling or drinking, you get to the point and you're blacking out and you hurt the people around you, and maybe you're hungover right now. You know, what about you have a hard time showing weaknesses, right? You want to have everything be a great show. You want to be on top of everything, and you've always wanted to change that about you, but you can't. But the right house and car and everything, this like portrayal of you is so important and you can't just get away from that. Maybe you're a control freak and you have a hard time handing over control to God, and that has messed with your relationship or ability to have a relationship with Him. You have deep insecurities. You've never loved yourself or like who you are, and you've wanted to change it for forever, but you've just not been able to for whatever which reason. Or fear. Maybe fear drives all of the decisions you make. Not your excitement for something or your joy for something, but that is the main driver for you. Maybe it's not you. Maybe it's someone else. Maybe you've been trying to help someone along with their faith for a decade, and you're starting to ask yourself, man, this person is never going to change. You know what I'm talking about? Like the kind of person who says, I can't come to church. I might catch on fire when I walk in the doors, you know? Like that kind of person, and you're starting to think, you know what? You're right. There is no chance that I'm going to change. When I talk about change, a name and a face has to be a part of this conversation. And maybe that's you. You know, maybe you're holding up a mirror, or maybe it's someone close to you, someone you're sitting with, or someone in your family, or a close friend. But either way, it is important, and we're going to struggle with it together. And we're going to struggle with it through the lens of a man from the Old Testament named Jacob. For those of you that aren't familiar with Jacob, we see him in the very first part of the Bible. And Jacob was a grandchild of Abraham, right? So you church kids that sang that Father Abraham song, I never learned that one. I think people look weird when they're doing it. Right. So he's a grandchild of Abraham. So Abraham, remember, he was originally Abram, became Abraham, and he was promised, tons of descendants, more than would number the sand. They had a son, Isaac. Isaac and Rebekah had Jacob. So that is kind of our family tree, and Jacob is the one that we are going to be talking about today. And it's interesting because Jacob is essentially the traditional ancestor of the people of Israel. And we're actually going to talk about why that is important and how there's a great meaning behind that. But according to the Old Testament, Jacob was the youngest twin brother of Esau. So his mom had twins, all right? And the interesting thing is while mom was having twins, she was having these weird pains in her stomach. And the story tells it that Jacob and Esau are literally fighting each other in the womb before they even come out. A couple of you, moms that have 2 or more boys, you're like, that is 100% true. Absolutely, right? So these guys are fighting from the very beginning. And not only that, when Esau is born and then Jacob immediately after, it says in Scripture that Jacob was born holding on to the heel of Esau. That's actually where some believe he got his name Jacob. That literally can be interpreted to hold on to the heel or grabs at the heel. A lot of times because names were so important back then. The names had something to do with, their lineage. It could have had something to do with the circumstances of what was going on in the world at the time, or as well, a characteristic of their birth, something that stuck out or something that was important. So he ended up with the name Jacob. So they grow up, and the fighting doesn't stop there. He had some continuing conflict in his life. So he started to do a couple shady things. And this is what I love about Jacob. A lot of times people read about Bible characters, and they're like, they're so perfect. No, they're screwed up, all right? So if you're like, oh, I just want to be like a Bible character, you are already. You've got that down, all right? So they grow up, and they start to get in some weird circumstances. So the brothers are hanging out. Older brother is starving. He's basically like about to die because he is so hungry. He hasn't had enough food, right? So he is so hungry, he asks his brother for food that he had made. And the brother, Jacob, says, okay, I will give you this food in exchange for your birthright. And Esau, being so hungry and with no other choice, he says, okay, I will give you my birthright, which is basically a firstborn inheritance because he was born just before Jacob, right? So that move in and of itself is kind of shady. Like, your brother's starving, and you're like, only if you give me all of your inheritance. You'd be like, okay, fine. So that's the first shady thing he did, right? Well, then, when his father became old and he was about to actually hand this birthright down, he was going to give it to Esau, his older brother, but instead, he wanted to get it directly from his dad. So what he did is, his dad was old, right? His dad had bad vision. He was really getting up there. So he was going to pretend to be his brother to accept this birthright, all right? So this is where things get kind of weird, all right? So to accept the birthright, he realized he couldn't impersonate his older brother because his older brother was really hairy. He was hairy. He had hairy arms, a hairy face. He was just a hairy dude. So what he did is he took goat skin, right, and the wool, and he put it on his arms, and he got in close, a little stinky, but his dad was like, is that really you? Is that really you? He's like, yes. And he's like, all right, it doesn't sound like you. He's like, it's me. And he touches his arm that's all hairy, and he's like, you're right, that is you, right? So he's kind of doing all these weird moves and deceiving people around him. He is not necessarily making the right choices, a little bit crazy. So he gets in this circumstance. His brother finds out that he did this, and his brother is furious, and his brother's going after him to the point where Jacob's mom is like, hey, you should probably go lay low for a while. I think your brother wants to kill you. So he literally went into exile, and he moved somewhere else for a long time, all right? So it kind of sets up the story that we're going to be talking about. While he's gone, he has 12 kids. He has 12 kids, and he builds this life. These 12 kids end up turning into the 12 tribes of Israel, right? These 12 kids start coming back to the land that he was promised, Canaan, right? The land that Abraham was promised. So they're coming back into town, and this sets the scene for everything that is about to happen, all right? So this will get us to Genesis 32, verse 23 through 28. After he had sent them across the stream, so they get to this river, which is basically the Jabbok Ford, the Zarka River now. It's like a tributary of the Jordan River. They get to this place, right? He sent them across the stream, sent over all of his possessions. So Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him till daybreak. When the man saw that he could not overpower him, he touched the socket of Jacob's hip, so that his hip was wrenched as he wrestled with the man. Then the man said, let me go, for it is daybreak. But Jacob replied, I will not let you go unless you bless me. The man asked him, what is your name? God asked him to reveal his name because remember I said that names mean a lot in the Old Testament many times? The reason why he asked him to admit his name is because more than just his name is coming up with that. He's admitting his identity. He's admitting that he's grabbing at the heel. He's admitting his deceptions, right? Despite his past, the Lord decides to bless him anyway. But he must fully submit first in order to get that blessing from this angel or God. Jacob, he answered. Then the man said, your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you have struggled with God and with humans and have overcome. Jacob said, "Please tell me your name." But he replied, "Why do you ask my name?" Then he blessed him there. Any of you grow up wrestling with a sibling? Any of you? A couple of you guys out there? I absolutely did. Now, my brother is 4 years younger than me, which means I was much bigger than him for a very decent portion of his life, right? So we would wrestle ever since he was really little. And my poor mom and our poor house, we grew up and like door frames don't work well anymore, like drywall was getting pushed in, like no tables like could stand like all of the wrestling that happened. Well, anyway, like I said, I was 4 years older than him, so we wrestled a whole lot. Well, my brother, because of where he was in life, he decided that instead of going to college, he was going to go into the military. Some of you are like, I know where this is going. So he went into the military, and not only that, he decided to go Army infantry. So he's 18 years old. He goes away to boot camp, and then after that, he goes to basic training. After basic training, he comes back, and our family decided to have a beach trip. And at this beach trip, when he arrived, he walks in, and I just want to kind of describe this for you. So he's got about 80 pounds on me. He's 2 or 3 inches taller, and the dude is just made of muscle. I mean, I have been pushing this kid around his entire life, and finally, he just walks in like this, and we make eye contact, and I know that 18 years of pain is coming down on me. So he looks at me, and he's like, "Come on, boy." And he comes up, and he just grabs me, and he throws me onto this couch, and he's twisting my arm back, and my tax dollars went to teaching that guy how to beat me up. This was my own doing. So he comes back, and somewhere in between me, asking for my mom's help, yeah, I did that. I'm not embarrassed. The word came out of my mouth. Some of you know what word I'm talking about. Any of you with brothers know what word I had to say at some point? Uncle. That's right. Uncle! It was probably said more like, uncle. It was bad. I mean, the dude, to this day, he's a monster, man. He could still take me. But he's my bodyguard now instead. But, so I say uncle, and he lets me go. And that was the first and last time I ever fought that guy, because there was no point after that. Because when I said uncle in that moment, I had transferred submission, right? I had said to him, look, I was in charge now. Physically, you are in charge now. This is a passing of the torch. It is yours now. And we did that just by saying uncle in that moment. We knew that word carried a weight. Jacob, when he said, "My name is Jacob," he was admitting his flaws, his failures, his past. And God didn't look at him and go, "You did what? You were grabbing at people's heels? You're being a deceiver? You did what to your family?" He didn't do that. No, he did something that was so special. And it's my favorite part of this story is he looked at him and he gave him a new name. He gave him a new name. In that moment, he became Israel. For those of you that aren't familiar with the word, Israel comes from the two words Serah and El. Literally contends with God, wrestles with God, fights with God, struggles with God. He got this name, and he said in that verse, "You are the one who has struggled with God and with men, with the world, and moved on past that." My favorite part is that when fighting with God, God did not let Jacob's past define him. Jacob's new name pointed to only his future. It's like in so many words, he communicated what I want to communicate to you, the one thing I want to communicate to you. And it's that your past does not define you. Your past does not define you. your childhood past, your past marriage, your past relationships, your past mistakes, the past that was yesterday. It does not define you. God looks at you and says, I'm going to give you a new name. Now, some of you are sitting here and you're skeptical, and I get that. You know why? Because I'm an 8. I'm cynical. I'm skeptical. I doubt everything. I question anything. I have a hard time sitting in church because a lot of times I sit there and I go, internally, but that's what I do. So I know some of you are sitting there thinking, dude, I have had this issue since as long as I can remember. You want to come up here and wave your spiritual wand and make everything all better. That's not how it works. I understand that. There are two sides of this coin, and I get that. I know there's something that I could stand up here and I could tell you about how our brains can rewire themselves, right? How the latest research on neuroplasticity shows that you can literally recreate the pathways in your brain to create new habits and a new lifestyle or new characteristics, right? I could talk about how different mindfulness research has shown that you can, through trying new things and having new education and having things repeated over and over again, that you can start to show signs of changing these various things that are going on in your life. But that's not why you came here today, right? You can learn those in med school or YouTube. You can learn those things wherever. But what you are going to learn here today and what you're hoping for today is that thing that's been inside of you that you've wanted to change for so long, that there is something out there, an extra something, an extra help, a divine help that can get that thing from what it was to what it has to be. Something that can be an extra fight. But remember, it didn't come easy for Jacob. He had to fight for it. He fought all night long, and at the end of it, he ended up with a permanent disability, with a busted hip, and walked with a limp for the rest of his life. So I wonder what's holding you back from that thing that you want to change. Maybe it's fear. Like I said, but I love it. 1 John 4:18 says, there's no fear in love, but perfect love drives out fear. Because fear has to do with punishment. The one who fears is not made perfect in love. Or maybe you're like me. Maybe you, to some degree, you think, this is just who I am. And that's not going to change. But the reality is that's a learned behavior. You've probably been told that you are this thing since you were a kid. And no wonder that you get to a point where you're like, you know what, this is just in my wiring, in my makeup, this is just who I am. And a lot of it has to do with the voices that you've been listening to from time and time again. These voices that are telling you this is who you are. But what about that voice that God has been whispering in your ear, and he finally wants to yell, the one that says, therefore, if anyone is in Christ, the new creation has come, the old has gone. The reality is, God is in the new creation business. That's what he does. So if you're stuck with a thumbs down or a thumbs in the middle, what we need to do is convince you that it is a thumbs up if you're giving God the credit that God deserves. This is why what we're doing next week is so important. Next week we're doing a baptism service here at CCV. Some of you have never actually handed any of this stuff to God because God hasn't been present in your life at all. And that's what's so special about baptism. I love that it is described as literally a watery grave, that you go down and a new creation comes up. And I love that. In your actual books, I forget what they're called, but in that thing is one of these blue cards. And it's called a baptism card, and literally you fill out that you want to do a baptism. You might as well, it's so cheesy, but it's kind of like a new creation card. Like, hey, I want to be a new thing now. That's what I want. So if you want to be that new creation, you want to take steps to doing that new creation, then take this out, fill it out, and put it in a bucket. It's like the easiest thing you've ever had to do in your life and taking a step towards something. I remember this kid who was 18 years old when I was youth pastor here, and the first time I met him, he said, I just want you to know ahead of time, I think all of this is crazy, and I think that people that believe in it are a little questionable. I was like, oh, thanks. Nice to meet you. More than that moment, my favorite moment of him was actually a couple years after that when I got to baptize him in a stream in Tennessee. I can still picture the tears in his eyes from finally being able to hand over the things from his life that he needed to hand over. I also know another person who was stuck so deep in addiction, their middle name might as well have been relapse. It was so many times. And I remember this person handing it all over to God and remaining sober for over a decade. Now, don't get me wrong, this person fought hard, right? They also attended 3 meetings a week and changed their entire lifestyle. Jacob had to fight instead of just asking God for help. God fought with him. God wrestled with him. And he had to ask for that blessing. He had to go and say, God, you know what? I want this. And some of you walked in the door today and you have the name scared written all over you, or controlling, or angry, or anxious, bored, skeptical, depressed, tired. I don't know. It could be so many different things. And God says, Jacob, you know what? I'm going to meet you where you're at, out in the wilderness, and we're going to fight, and now you are Israel. Maybe you're Israel now. Maybe you're in the middle or about to start the fight that you need for the change in your life. But it's going to be a fight, but God makes that fight different. It's a weight on the scale that makes it unfair. Maybe you are leaving today and your name is peace, finally, for the first time and forever. Or patient instead of throwing things. Or dependable. Or committed. Maybe next week your name is just new. In a moment, the ushers are going to pass communion. It's a pretty holy moment, just kind of remembering that sacrifice. And I love how important that time is, not just as like a moment to remember God, but as a moment of reflection of what that sacrifice, the power that we have from that sacrifice. And while it's being passed, I want you to think about the question that we asked today. Is it really possible to change? The answer is 100% absolutely yes. But it creates 2 new questions I want you to meditate on. Do you trust him to help you with that change? And are you willing to fight for it? Let's pray. God, thank you so much for today. Life is hard. And it feels like sometimes we are just stuck in our ways. And we feel like we've tried everything and we've just been stuck in the same habits or the same problems over and over again, to the point where it feels like, you know what, I'm just going to admit this now. This is part of who I am. Today, we ask you not only for the strength, because you've always been giving us the strength, we ask you for the ability to acknowledge and recognize and receive that help that you've been offering all along. We ask that you give everyone today the ability to know, no matter how old or how long they've been struggling, they can be made new through you. Just need to listen who God says they are.